Good afternoon, excuse me, good morning in Washington, good afternoon in Europe. My name is John Herbst, and I run the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. We have a terrific event to you. The noted economist Alina Rybakova will be providing a summary of her latest paper on the Russian economy in 2025 between stagnation and militarization. We have also joining us on a panel to discuss her paper, Alexandra Prokopenko, who is a senior fellow or fellow at the Carnegie Center, Eurasia Center in Berlin, and a former employee of the Russian Central Bank, so she knows her stuff. Someone else who knows the stuff and works with me here at the Atlantic Council, but in the Economic Center, Charles Lickfield. And I think everyone in the audience also knows the noted journalist Mikhail Zygar. So with that, Elena, we turn it over to you to discuss the paper, and then we'll bring the panel together.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. It's a pleasure to be here. And of course, thank you, Alexandra, Charles, Mikhail. All our listeners are in for a treat. So I'll speak briefly about the paper, about 10, 15 minutes, and then I'll pass it on to my distinguished co-panelists today. So Russian economy between stagnation and militarization, it's a little bit of both, right? You know, we usually talk about the glass half full, half empty. It is half full with things we really don't want to see here. So indeed, it's between stagnation and militarization. So maybe stepping back and thinking, how did we actually get here? We didn't start here in 2022, and arguably we didn't even start here in 2014. And Mikhail has written a lot about it in terms of the autocratic or governance issues that led us here, but we're not going to go that far. I just want to remind listeners that indeed we started in 2014, and the first sanctions actually took place then. However, since 2014 till 2022, Russia has built what's we call Fortress Russia, basically trying to go towards isolation, maybe even sort of kind of disconnecting from the Western supply chains, Western sort of stopping integration with the West and trying to insulate itself against sanctions. It was only partially successful, but in 2022, with a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Russia came under further sanctions, but the economy did not collapse, although many people did expect it. What kind of sanctions were implemented at the time? You know, I think the most important ones would be the oil or energy sanctions and export controls. We can also maybe discuss during the Q&A financial sector sanctions, but I don't want to focus on them too much at the moment. So fast forward to the conclusions. Well, there are finally some trade-offs. Russia is feeling the trade-off between spending on the war and spending on its domestic population. And the key question is, why did it take it so long to get to this point? And I think the most important answer here is that Russia is still producing and exporting something that it's digging up from the ground, and it's still valuable globally. So I think that's one of the major reasons why it took this long, even with the imperfect implementation of the sanctions, for Russia to finally start feeling this trade-off. So what has happened cyclically in the last few years? We've heard a lot about Russia's spectacular growth, which made it maybe 3-4%. Some call it spectacular, but you know, we also shouldn't forget that Ukraine also was growing at 2-3% after collapsing significantly in 2022. Nonetheless, you know, you cannot say that Russia didn't have a cyclical upswing. Why did it have a cyclical upswing? Is because of the significant military spending. And here I'm just using CIPRI numbers, not to have a debate, but we could actually suspect that probably the current spending is much more because some of the military spending gets spread across different categories in Russia. And then if you'd go further and do a PPP adjustment to this military spending, right, then the number jumps even further. So it's a significant short-term upswing, cyclical upswing, thanks to the military spending. And not surprisingly, where did that military spending go? Well, that military spending went to the military sectors. So as we started discussing earlier, Russia exports a big chunk of oil and gas and other commodities. It had passed it on to a significant upswing in military spending. And then indeed, war-related industries performed relatively well, very, very well relative to the other types of manufacturing or other types of activity in the last 3 years. So indeed, it's a country that is highly focused on military production. How could Russia finance it despite the sanctions? As we'll remember, Russia is a very important oil and energy and other commodities exporters. And the reason Russia was successful is because oil is a commodity, is a rather freely tradable commodity, and Russia could divert away from Europe towards India and China. And that's what you see on the graph. The blue bars are shrinking and the green ones are expanding. And while in the beginning it felt the pressure from the sanctions, with time, Russia found a way to make sure that they use their own ships, they use their own services, their own insurance, basically non-G7 related shipping and services. And that's what we call so-called shadow fleet. They use that shadow fleet to be able to avoid oil price cap measure by the G7. As you can see, for oil, it is now a significant share of seaborne oil is shipped with this special shadow fleet. It is much less for products, but that is because the product caps are set too high. So basically, they're oftentimes not binding, and that's why for Russia it's not worth investing into the shadow fleet. Why was Russia allowed to develop its shadow fleet? Because it took the coalition of countries a long time to start paying attention to the shadow fleet, sanctioning it. And even then, we still lack coordination. And here, just presenting here the sanctions by the US, UK, European Union, other countries. And you see the sort of in this Venn diagram, the overlap is increasing, but it's still, no, it's far from complete. And if you look at the share of the US, the number of the tankers sanctioned by the US is actually very small. They, in a way, pioneered this approach of sanctioning the shadow tankers themselves, not the companies. But at the same time, this year, they have largely backed off from sanctioning shadow fleet. And other countries like UK in particular and Europe have been moving much more aggressively. So what else has been an important factor in this Russia's ability to wage the war? Well, China has stepped in early on and provided an important lifeline to Russia's economy and military-industrial complex. And this is, of course, buying energy products from Russia. It is also providing important components for Russian military-industrial complex, as well as other products that allowed Russian companies to continue refocusing on militarization. And this is very sort of well-known facts that, Russia, again, has pivoted away from Europe towards China. So what does Russia export? Again, it's mostly raw materials, which is particularly probably in the historical perspective is disappointing because Russia actually used to export to China more sophisticated machinery some 20 years ago, but now has fully pivoted to the low value added raw materials. And what is it importing from China? Well, it is indeed machinery, vehicles, and other manufactured goods. So basically, China has stepped in and helped Russia with its economic growth and focus on the military-industrial complex. If we look at the critical technologies or dual-use goods or so-called common high-priority goods, you can see that very early on, already in 2022, in autumn and summer of 2022, China steps in and replaces some of the products that Russia loses because of the export controls. However, these are not necessarily produced in China or not necessarily Chinese products. They might be produced in China because of the joint ventures with the Western companies or maybe licensing agreements, or maybe they're just shipped via China or just via companies registered in places like Hong Kong, but almost 80 to 90% of sanctions evasions on export controls does happen via China. So now I'll move very quickly. What does it mean for Russian economy? We have seen that military-industrial sector does very well. And we also know that Russian economic geographically is highly uneven. And pay attention, this is in logs. So we do see a very sort of strong couple of sectors, couple of parts of the economy, and then the rest tended to lag historically. So what has happened most recently? We have seen a very perverse income convergence where the sharpest growth has been in the regions with the lower income per household, and more often than not in the regions that are concentrated on the military-industrial complex. And we see it in the central Ural regions, Volga district, sort of central region, Ural region, Volga district. We see, for example, Sverdlovsk Oblast, which has been doing very well. And it is very clear. We see exactly the areas where the tank produces based, Ural Vagon Zavod, where in Nizhny Tagil, or other sort of factories. And you can almost sort of create this new economic geography based on the military-industrial complex. So very quickly, has that helped on convergence? Yes, it has helped on convergence. And you see the lower numbers mean higher convergence. So we've seen dramatic convergence among regions in the 2000s. Then there is stagnation, and you see the marker where the first war on Ukraine happened in 2014. Then you see the second war, and that's where you're seeing the second sort of the period of this perverse convergence where the weaker regions are indeed catching up. And that is giving you this very morbid way of economic social lift for some of the people in Russia. So now very quickly, moving on to conclusions before we move on to our debate, is that yes, Russia is facing the trade-offs, but we're not yet at the stage of the collapse. Yes, we see slower growth, lower oil prices, sanctions are having an effect, and we've seen a period of high inflation that forced central bank to react. We're also seeing important structural shifts in the economy. It is towards the wartime economy, and at the same time, it's moving away from the West with maybe higher quality of integration, maybe more higher value-added cooperations, integration into global value-added chains, while moving towards the East, where the relationship appears to be more transactional, exporting commodities and importing everything else without much of the investment links. Can sanctions be made more effective? Yes, can sanctions can be made more effective? Of course, it's more question of not lack of the tools, but lack of the political will. And especially the sort of the inconsistency in the recent months or year by the US does complicate efforts for European Union and the UK, and we can talk more about that. But going forward in terms of preventing Russia's war of aggression elsewhere and sort of stopping it in Ukraine, it is the same objectives that we need to focus on. It is reducing the financing and reducing ability to produce tanks. And it's all the same conversation, how to reduce Russia's revenues from oil and how to prevent Russia from being successful in turning a fully militarized economy where that sort of with the help of maybe of China and others, where Russia can achieve productivity improvements. And then, of course, that would be very dangerous for all. So again, it's the main constraint is political will, not necessarily lack of policy tools. With that, I will stop here and pass it on back to you, Ambassador. Thank you so much. I'll stop sharing the slides.
Alina, that was wonderful. Thank you very much. And the presentation was outstanding. Okay. Your report states that the U.S. has more leverage reducing Russian energy revenues than people might think. Can you explain this view for the audience?
Thank you so much. So there are many measures that we can do. And one of them, most recently, is the impact on key Russian Rosneft and Lukoil enterprises that were sanctioned by the U.S. and put on the list. Well, this is one of the examples of the measures that are sort of an example of what could work if taken seriously. Here, the next question is where there will be some licensing or allowances for this for the trade to continue while we do not know what's happening. So the devil with sanctions is always in the detail. On paper, putting Russian oil companies on the list is a fantastic measure, and one can basically close off almost all of the Russian companies because they're very concentrated. But the question is, do you enforce it? And here the first question is licensing. US is not very transparent in terms of how it gives licensing. So if I go to any government website, I do not know, even on aggregate, how many licenses and especially why were given for certain sanctions, sort of bypassing sanctions, right? Of course, you could say it's confidentiality measure. You know, you don't want to say specific company got this specific license, but some way of reporting on it, I think would make it definitely more transparent. This is first. The second one is keeping the threat of secondary sanctions and executing the threat when it's necessary. We haven't seen US use it over the last year. And let me unpack the secondary sanctions. We talked relatively little about the financial sector sanctions, but they remain at the core of the effectiveness of US sanctions regime. Why? Because going back all the way back to unfortunate events of 9/11, after that, the US invested a lot into global anti-money laundering initiatives, domestically and internationally. FATFA, initiatives to stop, terrorist financing and also sort of illegal money flows around the world. So US was not fighting it alone. It was doing it with other countries. And because of creating that regime, it also created the unique opportunity to be able to trace the money and to be able to stop the money. And that's where the secondary sanctions are so important. It says that even though you're a third country bank, you will lose access to global, effectively, not just US, but global financial system if you do something illegal. And I think that's where the key issue is. If you facilitate Russia's oil trade, or for example, export controls evasion, if you still can be found and put under sanctions, I think this is one of the most effective measures.
Thank you. One other quick follow-up. What about the economic impact of Ukraine's increasingly effective drone strikes on Russian hydrocarbon infrastructure?
And also on the shadow fleet, right? You know, I could put another
Yes.
Venn sort of circle there, saying how many tankers Ukrainians have hit with their sea babies. So I think so far it has been very effective. Russia's oil production is difficult to stop, and I think maybe colleagues here will, will add or argue with it. But generally, majority of the fields are older fields, and it's very hard to stop and reopen. So Russia needs to continue producing oil. At the same time, if they're not processing it domestically, they probably end up selling it to the global market. And we actually have seen some pickup after the more effective sort of damage to the domestic processing capabilities. So I think that is one that has been effective. And the second one with the shadow fleet, we have seen cases where sanctioned shadow vessel has continued to travel. It is much less frequent with the US sanctioned shadow vessel because of the secondary sanction threat. But of course, if there is a direct attack on that shadow vessel, many of them are very old. It is almost impossible to repair, and they're effectively out of commission. There is only a limited number of vessels one can buy per year, and the new supply, sort of adding new tankers to the market, is just much harder and takes longer time. So that effectively limits Russia's ability to use the shadow fleet.
Thank you. Okay. Alexandra Prokopenko, thank you for being with us. How do you assess the paper's analysis of the Russian government's military Keynesianism, military spending to juice the economy?
Hello, everyone. Ambassador Herbst, thank you for the question. First, I need to say that it was an excellent piece, and I really enjoyed reading it. The empirical work was really great, particularly the regional analysis, which is unusually we can meet in a papers produced from abroad, and the way how you frame the deathnomics in places like Tiva, where military payments now dominate household income, was really incredible. I also like the way I just want to add that I also like the part about the asymmetry between the relationship of Russia and China, because it's also very important, and this granular data helps us to understand more broadly how the how this relationship works. And I think that the framework of economic stress to Russia naturally leads to a question about sustainability and breaking points and sanctions. That's what we're discussing. But I think that we can also consider a little bit broader framework that Russia has undergone a structural transformation, which was created a new equilibrium for Russia's economy. And this equilibrium is negative, which is characterized by lower growth potential, technological degradation, and inefficient resource allocation, which is nevertheless stable in the sense that exit from this is blocked by the very changes that created it. So Russia's stuck in a sort of political structural crisis. For example, if we're talking about 50% output growth in military sectors, or civilian adaptation or civilian aviation, which collapsed and now struggles and asking for money from National Wealth Fund, which is drying up, or manufacturing wage growth concentrated in regions where military industry complex industry allocates. I think there are not temporary allocations, but this type of the new structure of Russian economy represents is fundamental restructuring of productive capacity. When factories retool from civilian to military production, when supply chains reorganize around defense procurement, When regional labor markets orient towards military wages, which now is valid for a big part of Russia, these create path dependencies, and the economy doesn't simply have a military sector. It has become a heavily militarized economy in its productive structure. So that's why I'm saying that this was a structural, and this is very important for us, not thinking about when Russia stopped, but how we need to think about new Russia's economy and how it impact economic distribution, how it will impact economies of European Union, United States. I think the political economy of the current the political economy of Russian system now depends on military spending in a way that makes reversal existentially threatening to the regime. So it does. I don't mean that the war wages Putin. No, Putin is still politically capable to taking the decision, but even if war stops because of the agreement between Ukrainian leadership, U.S. administration, and Russia, it doesn't stop Russian military industry complex. So because from military industry complex now, regional stability depends, and labor market function and fiscal federalism all now is based on a military industry complex.
Thank you.
So
please continue.
Just 1 minute, that I think if we're thinking about ending the war and security guarantees, Putin speaks a lot, and which potentially and probably he would accept it to some extent. It doesn't make the revolution in defense procurement, which was already happened in Russia. That's why I'm saying that this is structural, and Russian economy isn't a temporary wartime configuration waiting to return to normality. It has become a heavily militarized economy for its fundamental structure, and this is a new normality we need to live with. And I think the real question for policymakers is not how much we can pressure Russia until Putin will decide to change his policy, but do we understand what it means that Russia has chosen a course from which it cannot return, and how Europe and United States, how the global community will react on this? Thank you.
Good, thank you. Charles, the report talks in detail about how China's come to Russia's rescue. What's your take on the report's treatment of the Russians' relation with China, how it has evolved as Moscow seeks to evade Western sanctions?
Thanks. I mean, I often start speeches when talking about reports on saying how wonderful it is and what a privilege it is to work with impressive people. But I really mean it this time. It's a real report, and it's a pleasure to speak with very impressive people as well. I think I'm the only non-native Russian speaker with Ambassador Herbst on this panel, but I do remember some from my time in Moscow, and I've been trying to follow what's going on anecdotally in Russia by reading the economic press. But this really does an excellent job of showing the evolution of the economic relationship with China. I think anyone who'd been following Russia up until the full-scale invasion of 2022 knew that this would be a big hole in the racket of sanctions. Doesn't mean that sanctions were futile, and I think most of the panelists will agree that we have achieved some things through our sanctions, but this was always going to be a weakness that we would be working with. Elena and her co-author Lucas rightly raised how humiliating it must be or should be for Russia that the structure of trade has evolved so starkly. Only 20 years ago, Russia was exporting technology to China, and now it's really quite a simple relationship where Russia sells rare earths, critical minerals to some extent, and mainly hydrocarbons to China. There's some arms being sold from Russia to China, but Russia has to hold on to most of those for obvious reasons. And in return, it gets its technology from China. And this is everything from smartphones to televisions to cars increasingly, and unfortunately, quite a lot of dual use products as well. That gray zone, China has entered that for a long time. They have stayed away from lethal aid, but everything else, they're fully in it. And at the Atlantic Council Geoeconomic Center with our sister centers, we've been briefing US government and others on this gray zone. I think there was some wishful thinking at the beginning that we could scare the Chinese out of venturing into this gray zone. I think they've really been there for a long time. So there hasn't been lethal aid, but I think that's not really a relevant threshold to look at. The dual use exports have been crucial in helping Russia in its war effort. And then the income has been crucial as well. But it still makes it a very simple relationship. China has not really increased its presence in the Russian economy. There have been some investments in factories, but really very little, especially given that the Western finance has cleared out of Russia. There was an opportunity there and China has stayed clear of that. Is that because of sanctions or is that because of China's sort of calculus on how to deal with the Russians? Obviously, you want the regime to stay in place. You want there to be a sort of symbiotic relationship, but one that's simple. But you don't really want to be involved in joint ventures, in sharing technology, or in investing in the Russian economy or for the prosperity of Russian society. So I think that's one distinction to make. This isn't to give China any excuse for what it's doing, but it's just interesting to me that there hasn't been a flourishing of this economic relationship into something more complicated. Beyond that calculus that China is making, there is also the question of whether or not they're scared of Western sanctions. I think on some occasions it has been clear that they have been, or at least Chinese economic actors are. One example is the Chinese banking sector, which has been present in Russia through some loans to corporates. When even the European Union, Alina mentioned that when the US is involved because of secondary sanctions, that's much scarier and it tends to have an effect on third countries. Even the European Union, when it once gave itself just the mandate to sanction Chinese banks for being too present in the Russian economy, just that mandate being passed by the council scared off a lot of Chinese banks. Since some Chinese banks have actually been added to the list, but merely the mandate had a chilling effect on their presence, which I think is interesting. However, on the trends, I think things are a little bit concerning. This report was written before the news that Russia has issued a sovereign bond in yuan, which has been bought by some Chinese economic actors. This is, in terms of its economic significance and its size, not huge, $3 billion. But I think it really is crossing a threshold between something we hadn't seen before. China had not been lending to the Russian government since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. And now we've crossed that threshold. And it really opens a huge untapped resource for Russia to go into to fund its deficit, which I think is concerning. Since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, the deficit has been small compared to in Western governments. The deficits that are left behind by Western governments, about 2% of GDP. So actually in the first year is only 1.5%, so quite small. But of course, Russia's resources to fund that deficit have been finite. Alexandra rightly mentioned that the National Welfare Fund, or at least for the liquid part, is now becoming depleted. But this was always something of an artificial frontier. I think some people, again, wishful thinking on the part of Western thinkers, including myself sometimes, said, well, when they run out of the National Welfare Fund, they'll really face a lot of trouble. I think it's interesting that China has waited till this point to start lending. Again, is that because they want Russia on its knees to extract better terms out of them? Do they want, were they worried about sanctions? And now they're no longer worried about sanctions. I think that's an interesting question for the rest of the panel. Why has China taken so long just to lend money to Russia? Otherwise, the economic relationship is quite simple, but sadly, it's been a crucial factor in enabling Russia to wage its illegal war.
Charles, thank you very much for that. Excellent. Mikhail, the report talks about one of Russia's most watched financial statistics, the bonuses that the government pays to those who sign up to fight in Ukraine and to those killed in action, or rather the relatives of those killed in action. How do you view Russia's use of financial incentives to maintain its war efforts, and what impact would this have in the longer term on Russia's poorer regions?
Thank you so much for the question, and Alina, congratulations on an amazing report. It gives us so many answers to a lot of questions, including political questions. One of the most popular questions is usually why the population of Russia is not protesting against such huge casualties. Where are the families, the mothers, the widows of those soldiers who were killed during the war? And here we have an amazing answer. which is like it's all about the money. It's all about the money. And to say more, we have a very interesting social consequence of this system of recruiting volunteers or contractors for the Russian army, which is sometimes called Russian Amazons, because somehow due to all those payments, we have a strong ally for the regime, which is the families and especially the wives of all those contractors, because we see that it's usually happening in the poorest regions, and the classic example of the family is family with very low income, a man who doesn't earn at all or almost doesn't earn, usually drinks, usually beats his wife and his kids. So for the wife, that's a dream to try to divorce him, but regularly she is afraid of doing that because she's afraid of being killed by her domestic abuser. So to sell this husband to the god of war is some kind of gift from the heaven. She gets the money, she gets rid of the domestic abuser, and I'm monitoring a huge phenomena in Russian social media, such as forums of all those widows or widows to be, who are eagerly discussing how to invest the money they received for selling their husbands to the war, which is the best way to not to lose all that income, but like to build the prosperity of their family on the fact of the sacrifice of their husbands. So we don't absolutely see any kind of remorse from huge part of Russian population affected by the war. On the contrary, we have a huge support, and this phenomena is very vividly described by all the economic terms and financial data in the report. So it's a really bad news, because we see that there is no protest among the families of those who are fighting in Ukraine. I think it's important, but especially it's important because for Russian political elite, or for President Putin, economic factors are somehow detached from political factors, and he feels that there is necessity to continue the war, and he sees that there is some huge level of popular support for what is happening, and he's satisfied with that.
Thank you very much. Concerning, absolutely, but really interesting. Okay, we've gone through one round of questions and we've taken up a fair amount of time. Please, I ask our panelists to keep their answers to no more than 3 minutes, so we get to audience questions. So, Alina, you write at the end of the report that the Kremlin's bills are not all coming due yet, so that even the steep costs that you describe are manageable. Under what conditions might pressure on the economy reach a point where Putin must reconsider his war on Ukraine?
I think it is a continuum. We tend to think about it, will be sort of a black and white sort of binary outcome, and it's not. I think we already see the fact that Russia has been trying to get Pokrovsk for the last year or more. Maybe it has gotten it. It's not clear from the latest reports. But this is a result of the fact that they don't have enough funding for a big scale offensive. And that's why instead of having progress on different parts of the front line, they have to focus on one or two and be able to throw a lot of resources in it. And maybe a year later, the army achieves what Putin asked them to do a year ago. So this is one. And then we haven't seen Russia's invasions anywhere else, right? That's also, we do not know the counterfactual. That's also good news. So this is part of the answer. The other part of the answer, it is a classical bubble, and Mikhail was also talking about it. It is a classical bubble, just like before the global financial crisis. As one of the bankers said, while the music is playing, we need to keep on dancing. And I think that's where we are also politically. And then finally, the oil price, and then the day, oil price plays a dramatic role. So about $10 per barrel per year maybe gives you foreign exchange inflows of about 1.5 percentage points of GDP. And I know Alexandra might give more precise numbers on this one, right? But and that is a big impact in terms of scaling Russia's ambitions. But I wouldn't think about the economy as strictly being able to end the war.
Thank you, and economical as well, your response. Okay, Alexandra, one of the most interesting pieces of Dr. Rybakova's paper is the analysis of the middle-income regions across Russia, catching up macroeconomically to the richer ones, largely because of, or almost entirely because of the military stimulus. How sustainable do you think this dynamic is for middle-income Russian regions, and what implications might this hold for the Kremlin, economic and political?
Well, that's what I talked, that military industry, reliance on military industry complex for Russia's economy becomes structural. And if we will assume that Russia's government will come up to the decision that they need to cut military spending, it would quite complicated to make without significantly reducing the demand, which creates financial well-being of people who lives in this type of regions. So sustainability of regional budgets, which now relied on the demand created by the state because of the military procurement, is huge, and this is a problem because Russia's system is quite rigid, so it's simply complicated for the government to allocate this type of resources to another type of regions and allocate with resources the labor force. So it caused to a lot of problems for Russian government. That's why that's why I think they are going to keep military spending elevated because of the war and after the war, because Putin needs to replenish arsenals. And so I talked already that security guarantees wouldn't make Putin to stop the war. Labor market restructuring to also require to absorb people who are already involved in military industry complex and those who are involved in those who are in trenches, and this is not an easy stuff to do. So I guess the problem is structural. Government knows about that, but there is some sort of as I explained this as a sort of unwritten agreement between monetarists and militarists in Russia, that in 2026 they will try to sit quietly and to keep economy afloat until the end of the year, when central bank would be forced to, when central bank will be able, not forced, but able to cut the key rate, and the economic development would become more sustainable, and then they will see. So that's my answer.
Thank you, and brief as well. Appreciate that. Charles, the authors of the paper talk about the U.S. sanctions regime as being used as a bargaining chip by the U.S. rather than a means to raise costs on military aggression. What are your thoughts on this? And specifically, we know that in late October, Trump put serious sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil, but seems to have eased them recently. What is the impact?
So I'll start with the sort of simpler side and answer your last question, but I promise I'll get on to the whether or not the sanctions are being used as a bargaining chip and my thoughts about what the Trump administration should do. But first, Lukoil and Rosneft sanctions. I mean, including some softening and some exemptions, some licenses, isn't necessarily a bad sign. It could be a sign that these will actually be enforced quite seriously, because the sanctions being brought in so quickly do create problems for actors who aren't the bad guys, in inverted commas. the fact that there are actually still gas stations in New Jersey that belong to the Lukoil brand or have them on their frontage might be a little bit surprising to people who don't live in the US, but it's the reality. And so, do you want those just to be mothballed and untouchable by any financial institution, or do you want to create some kind of safe transition out of being within the Lukoil network and then remove the license? So creating some licenses, and that's what the first license was for. It was for the gas stations in the US, isn't necessarily a bad sign. I think another interesting comment to make on this is, had we been under the Biden administration, bringing in these two sanctions, sanctioning these two very important firms without consultation with allies would have been seen as rude and creating difficulty for them, because there are a lot of assets that need to be sold or passed on in Germany as well. However, Europeans have learned to deal with this administration to the extent that any news suggesting that the Trump administration is adding to the pile of sanctions rather than removing from the pile of sanctions is simply seen as good news, and they just live with it. And so this was celebrated, even if exactly the same action without coordination under Biden would actually have created some tension. So I think
a smart insight.
I think that tells you something about how relations have evolved. In February, they were very scared about sanctions being removed. I know some of them are enshrined by Congress, but even that is complicated given the implementation is done by the executive branch. And so the fact that not that many have been removed, Alina's absolutely right that more could have been done, especially on the shadow fleet. The US was a pioneer in sanctioning individual ships, and none have been added since the transition. However, the fact that the pile has been added to rather than subtracted from is overall seen as a good thing by allies, especially EU and the UK. Japan, South Korea, others still participate in the sanctions coalition, of course, but they don't bring it up as much of an issue because they have other things to be dealing with the Trump administration. So that was my little aside on whether licenses are a good thing or not. Hopefully, it does mean that the sanction is actually seriously applied. The proof will be in the implementation and maybe the fines that come in, and there haven't been any yet. On the broader point about whether or not sanctions are being used as a bargaining chip, it really depends on who you talk to in this administration. When European embassies consult with the State Department and with technical teams in OFAC, there is still a sense of a team moving in one direction. But then they can't help but notice that in some of the drafts, the 28-point plan that was negotiated with the Russians, I think in Miami, and other drafts that have come out since that are perhaps a little bit less worrisome, but still, there is this idea of economic normalization with Russia. This has been around since the beginning of the administration, but it was there black on white in some of these draft plans. So who stands to gain from economic normalization with Russia? I think it's very important to remind people watching in America and in the administration, if you're listening, that economic normalization with Russia cannot just come if the US sanctions are lifted. Russia is much closer to Europe. It used to have a bigger trading relationship with Europe. And then a lot of the things that are very headline worthy, like SWIFT, Euroclear, institutions that Russia wants access to or that has an important relationship with, those sanctions depend on European decisions, not on the US. So an economic normalization with Russia cannot just be done if the US lifts sanctions, and even that is technically difficult to do. Yes, there is a strand in the Trump administration that believes that in order to negotiate a peace agreement, you need to give Russia an incentive. I think they also, to keep the White House interested, always sprinkle a little bit of language about deals to be made. I don't think this necessarily means property deals and other deals in Russia. I think there is perhaps some interest in the energy sector in lifting the sanctions on collaboration in the Arctic. There's technology that Russia has not been able to access since the 2014 generation of sanctions. That's not the 2022 generation of sanctions. But yes, there might be some interest to some individual consultants in sharing technology that Russia wants. But I think this sort of broad normalization where US firms expose themselves to that kind of reputational risk of going back into Russia and all the regulatory uncertainty, because I think the central scenario has to be that Europe keeps the sanctions on. It's very hard for me to think of an economic normalization being possible, even if there are some people in the administration who would be in favor of that. And then one other point to make is, if there's any quick deals to be done, I don't think they would necessarily be investment into Russia, but rather individuals and groups coming off the SDN list and being able to invest in US property again, New York, Miami, etc. So that's not really a structural change and Russia being brought back into the global economy and trading with the West again. That's much more personal gain and investment into certain property markets in the US. I'm not using any names, but I think there are some people who might stand to gain from that. So those are the points I'd make more broadly. You need others in the G7 coalition to lift sanctions to even start talking about economic normalization with Russia. So I think that's a non-starter. Yes, in the administration, there are some people who mention this. Sometimes it's just this sort of general idea that if you want to be talking about peace, you need to give Russia a carrot on sanctions. And sometimes there is, I think, the appeal of personal gain. But I think it's really not structural. It's more to do with individual investment opportunities into the US. I'll stop there.
Charles, thank you very much for that. Mikhail, how would you assess the trade-off in terms of spending the Kremlin is making today on its full-scale war versus when the invasion began in 2022? Where can we see spending cuts, or where are we seeing spending cuts in Russian society?
I think that Elena's statement that the war cannot be stopped economically was very important, because I believe that that's true, and that what is happening in Russian society is really not connected to how Russian elite is feeling itself, and the change of the mood of Russian elite is obvious. Yes, in the beginning of the war, majority of Russian elite and Russian society as such was deeply shocked, but by the beginning of the war, and most of them were sure that Russian economy is going to collapse, everything is going to collapse, and it's amazing how different the mood is right now is. If we see, if I talk to different sources, and I hear something about some kind of war fatigue from those people who are somehow dealing with the war, who are more or less present there. At the same time, those people who used to be called who can be called systemic liberals sound much more patriotic, and that's them who are talking about the imminent victory and the war till the end. So that part of Russian society that has always been pro-Western and that is supposed to be very pacifist, and it doesn't mean that they are saying that only because they think that way. I think the key answer is that they don't believe that Putin is ready to stop this war, and no one is fooled by so-called negotiations or readiness of Vladimir Putin to start negotiations. And we have heard that Russian propaganda was fiercely criticizing even Trump's plan, which was a mirror of Putin's preconditions. It looks like that Putin is politically not ready to stop the war. He needs it. He needs it due to a lot of different reasons. First of all, due to his political reasons, because for him the war is the only the best possibility to control the whole country. At the same time, as Alexandra said, yes, the current Stalinist slogan, everything for the war, everything for the front, everything for the victory, that's how the current Russian economy is structured. That's how his view is structured. So, and he's not ready to change his approach, no matter what happens in Russian economy and what happens in Russian society. Although he doesn't see any significant change in Russian society, except for growing fatigue and growing acceptance of the fact that yes, the victory is needed by a huge part of Russian society.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll now turn to audience questions. The first question is directed to Elena from Erwan Lagadek. It's this. Is there a discernible oil price point under which Russian economy and budget actually does collapse? And what's the latest price assumption on which the Kremlin's budget is built?
So we all talk about this, what is the breaking point? And for Russia, we've had periods when the break-even point was closer to 40 than not. Of course, that has expanded in recent years. And, if oil price were to go back to 40, I think it would be definitely close to significantly slowing down Russian ability to wage the war, but I wouldn't call it collapse. Because Russian banks still hold, and I need to double check the number, I think it's about not more than 10% of their balance sheet is in their OFZ, in the government paper. Debt to GDP ratio is in the 20s. So there is a lot that can be done with financial repression, asking banks to hold more financing, even if the deficit increases. And deficit is not even 3% at the moment, right? And further, as Charles mentioned, you can go to renminbi market. OFZ did come out, the in renminbi or the government paper. Let's see how successful it will be, especially if the threat of sanctions continues. But if it subsides, then you can raise more money there. So it's all the question about making the policy space smaller rather than actually leading to the collapse. Maybe if oil were at 20, it will be to or 40. Well, of course, we'll have different situation, but I think it will still continue to drag on.
Thank you. Okay, we have a question from Rick Hanover, which I think also is for you, Alina, but I think others can comment as well. Your report describes that Russia's macroeconomic performance is more resilient than many expected. Which factors most surprised you to explain this in your research?
I think what surprised me the most is just how inefficient the sanctions have been, not because of the Russian economy was resilient. And I have to say, actually, I got a lot of, I want to say shit for calling Russian economy fortress Russia before, from some of the people saying, oh, you're like too pro-Kremlin, you're just too positive on their economy. Well, I wasn't surprised by that economy. What I was surprised just how ineffective the export controls have been. And let's remember the early months of 2022, there was 70% reduction in the import of this high priority battlefield goods, 70% reduction. By autumn, it went back to pre-invasion level. And that to me was disturbing. I think to what extent we underestimated or overestimated the ability to do export controls, especially after the story around Huawei, and somehow the US has discovered new tool and it's just so effective. BIS has only one enforcement officer, I think, or maybe two in Hong Kong. I mean, this is just non-starter, right? So I think to me, this was probably, that was the biggest surprise. And the second, not fully surprised, but the fact to what extent US resisted full service ban, full proper embargo on Russian oil, partially because of the midterms, and came up with this G7 idea, G7 oil price cap idea.
Okay,
and sorry, yeah,
please go ahead.
The oil price assumption, I think it's around 60s for the next budget. I forgot to answer that.
Okay, thank you. Alexander, do you want to jump in on this question?
Yeah. Thanks. Speaking on sanctions efficacy, I think I think it's very important to when we're now thinking about sanctions. I'm still calling to think about them in a more broader, more strategic way, since sanctions become more ordinary tool from extraordinary toolkit. So now more, we hear more and more that sanctions could be used on this, could be imposed on that, and the whole issue of imposing sanctions on Russia should be more investigated and researched. That's the first point. Second, I think financial sanctions were underestimated and they come up late. And they were gradual. I mean, gradual de-swifting. Russian economy was actually ready to de-swifting. So domestically, it operated without any major difficulties. But it to me, it was surprising and incredible how fast Russian financial institutions, accompanied with the Chinese intermediaries and intermediaries from third countries, built up the whole infrastructure, how to facilitate international transactions. And the big issue is that this infrastructure will remain regardless of the ending of the war. And this infrastructure will suit, it's not marginalized anymore. So it's not a transactions between pariah states like Iran or North Korea. It's a legitimate infrastructure which could be used by other market players and which could actually provide financial services cheaper than Western institutions. So I think that's this is an interesting implication of sanctions, which we need to take into consideration.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Charles, would you like to jump in on this?
I was just going to say, I mean, this is now kind of an old school point. Now, unfortunately, 4 years into the full-scale invasion, but I think some of us were surprised by just how well Russia withstood the initial shock. I know Elena didn't want to focus her remarks too much on financial sanctions, but the financial sanctions on the Russian economy, the immobilization of the assets, these were risky moves to make. I think it was worth a try to try to engender some kind of financial crisis in Russia, which may have given the Kremlin pause. That was the thinking. We all know it didn't work. It was worth a try. And now we're still sort of living with the consequences. I am pretty sure, because I know some of the people who made these decisions personally, they weren't thinking when they immobilized the central bank's assets in European and G7 jurisdictions that 3.5 years later we'd be debating how to use them, etc. It was really, the one time they could use this, and if there was one occasion and an opportune moment to use it, it was this. They knew about some of the risks, but they didn't necessarily know that we'd be debating what to do with it 3.5 years later. And how Russia withstood that shock is very relevant to what Alexandra was just saying. I mean, and an institution she knows well, the competency, unfortunately, of the Russian central bank is one of the main reasons. And this is an institution that wasn't even that popular between 2014 and 2022 because it was seen as demanding interest rates that were too high, but companies were complaining about it. I think they still do complain about interest rates that are very high, but I think people get why the central bank has been given so much authority. It really prepared Russia on all sorts of metrics to withstand a shock of this type. And one of the things that hasn't been mentioned yet, but a real factor, was capital controls. This is something that Governor Nabulina said she'd never do. So she's broken that promise. But it was an essential part of the reason why money stayed in banks. There wasn't a run on banks. They had an incentive to stay there because the interest rates were very high. And in 2014, Russia didn't even have a good, efficient interest rate channel. They were building it up at the time, but now the system is much more disciplined around a very credible central bank. Sorry to get a bit nerdy and technical, but unfortunately, that has all worked very well. And it's very textbook. It's a textbook case. Now, the breaking of that promise, the fact that Russia did bring in capital controls, they've been alleviated since then, but the fact that that promise has been broken may actually be one of the reasons that we could link back to the first point I made. Why hasn't China invested very much, and other investors? There's a risk of sanctions, there's reputational risk, but there's also the fact that Russia is now a country that has broken that promise, that has brought in capital controls. So that's another red flag for investors.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. Mikhail, you're the non-economist on the panel. I'll give this one to you. You've already talked about the impact, the political impact in regions of Russia, the poor regions of Russia, of what Alina smartly calls deathonomics, right? The payments to those who are killed. And you mentioned, by and large, this has reduced the problems of potential opposition to the war. Is there any anti-Kremlin sentiment, especially in those areas which have had the most casualties, or is this completely non-existent?
It's very hard to ask about anti-Kremlin sentiment because, the most popular phrase in Russia, or at least among those people I'm talking to, is «все понимают». Everyone understands everything. It means that it's clear for lots of people what is really happening, but it means that they can never express this publicly. It's known, it's clear that no one is going to protest openly. It seems to be crazy to start protesting, knowing of all the
risks.
Now, the number of political prisoners, the number of people who were imprisoned for posting, for tweeting, for writing something on Facebook, or for the private conversations with their friends. So it seems irrelevant even to question people if they are going to protest openly. At the same time, we have some weird examples of existing civil society in Russia. For example, during the last month, there was some kind of digital uprising which was targeted against a very well-known pop star. And this pop star, Larissa Dolina, won a court case against the person who bought her apartment, and this decision of the court was widely seen by the society as very unjust, as the example of the injustice in favor of someone who is closely affiliated with those in power. So she is not the part of the authorities, she is not the part of the government, but she is widely known for her ardent support of Putin, of the war. She is the member of the ruling party, and somehow she has become the most hated person in the country for the whole month. And there was such a tremendous social pressure on her, so she had to promise that she is going to give the money back to the person who became the victim of that unjust decision of the court. So it's a very weird way to illustrate the fact that some reminiscent of the civil society still exists, but clearly there is a huge protest potential within the society, but everyone knows that it's not the right time to express that point of view. But we see the potential that the hidden protest became the widely seen protest against a pop singer, but it's a very symbolic act.
Okay, that was a great way to end this excellent conversation. Alina, again, you and your co-author, congratulations on a great work. Congratulations to all for participating today, and we'll be doing more in this in the future. And thanks everyone for listening in.
Thank you.
Thank you.